It takes a long time to really understand a historical language. I spent the better part of 4 years studying Latin, and I still struggled a fair amount with it. But most people have some idea of what is meant when somebody mentions it, and I'm sure you did too when I mentioned Latin. This would not be surprising. There are Latin dictionaries, including a Google Translate option for it. There's a distinct people group that people would think of when Latin is mentioned, with togas and gladiators and so on and so forth. And likewise, there's a general region associated with the Latin language. We could say the same of Old English or Sanskrit, ancient Hebrew or ancient Chinese, and so on. The thing is, this is largely, though not entirely, an invented idea. The distinctions of a people group have always existed, but it has changed in the last few hundred years especially. As I've discussed in the What is a Language video, the distinction between a language and the dialects thereof is often posed as a matter of a dialect being a form of a purer standard variety. This is false, but it is bolstered by things like dictionaries and by extension official national languages, which you can look at in the video concerning nationalism and language. Just to drive home the point that the standard form of a language is not necessarily as standardized as other language dialects, consider, for example, Standard American English and Standard British English, and how if you wanted to express who owns each particular bookshelf, you would say my shelf, your shelf, his, her, its shelf, our shelves, their shelves, in the plural. You may see where I'm going with this. If I wanted to form an anaphor, this is just to say the referential pronoun. You would say myself, yourselves, himself, herselves, itself, ourselves, themselves. This means that the anaphoric pronoun is almost always formed from the possessive determiner plus self, with the exception of the masculine singular and the plural. This is not the case with African American English, wherein those forms highlighted before would be his self and their selves. This is therefore literally more standard when considering the construction of an anaphor, but not more standard when people are talking about standardized varieties as used by dictionaries and governments. In fact, the word self in English in all varieties is less common over all Indo-European languages insofar as there's only one form for both reflexive and pronominal uses. However, in a broader sense, I hope I've made the point that the idea of a standard language is far more political as a notion than a truly exclusively linguistic one. Plenty of people, millions of people, speak English in that way, but governments aren't going to put out laws, for instance, written in every single recognized dialect, because frankly that's overkill, and actually in places that are officially bilingual, this has on a few occasions led to things not being written out properly, like when Ireland legalized all drugs by mistake due to a misuse of the Irish language version of the law. What ends up happening is that, even for a modern language, there is a difficulty in organizing what actually is and isn't part of a given language, but this is compounded exponentially when you then apply that scope over a period of centuries or millennia. English grammar has changed, as has its phonology since the time of Shakespeare, which for the sake of time I'll redirect you to the Great Vowel Shift video for more details. Looking at Latin again, moreover, from the Kingdom period, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire, not to mention the Byzantine Empire, one can say that Latin was used both publicly, or at least officially, for 2,000 years. Even, by the way, Hungary used Latin from AD 101 until 1836 as the sole official language, which is interesting enough on its own, but it makes you question which Latin. There are certainly distinctions, archaic, classical, and so on, but these also have their own vague distinctions within them. Just consider how different someone would have sounded speaking some dialect or another of what would have been considered modern English in 1570, 450 years ago, realizing that some dialects too would have been more or less different to the English that you speak at home. Indeed, in 1570, a lot of legal and academic writing in English was conducted in Latin also, or indeed exclusively. With all that considered, this does raise the question, what on earth is Latin? When someone talks about Old English, the question is just as valid, but there is so much less in the way of personal and legal written documents that, not to mention the ones that have survived today, we look at the few and say, okay, this is Old English. This may be more of a linguistic issue in the particulars, but ultimately this is an epistemological one at its core. When we say that something is a language, what can we really say about Latin grammar, Latin vocabulary, that also takes into account regional variations, history, and so on? That is something I don't mean to raise a series of hypothetical questions about if they can't be answered. But instead, I want to just point out the few difficulties that comes with categorizing something which is ever-shifting. Even being a dead language does not protect against that kind of fluidity. I studied Latin grammar for 4 years. I read poems and speeches, memoirs and ethnographies. I filled out my declension and conjugation tables just like any other student of Latin. This whole video is not just to say that because there is variation that it undermines the pursuit of Latin or any other language, but instead to try to bring up some of the same concerns as exist with defining a modern language too. For example, we have to use something as a basis for what language is, especially when it's dead. It simply wouldn't work to try to teach every single form of language used by millions over thousands of years to someone who's just beginning to understand the very, very basics. What ends up happening, like today, is that there's a bit of historic luck, the right people having enough political power or literary sway that form the basis of all the definitions. It might have seemed, if you watched the video about nationalism and language, as if I was saying that all definitions and boundaries for a language are made up, but that's not true. Instead, we must simply bear in mind that this is a process of standardizing, formalizing, and nationalizing that has been going on well before the idea of any modern nation states. The need to group, to categorize, and fit things within boundaries is a simply human desire and a natural habit. We shouldn't run away from trying to understand language in a historical way, but really to understand them better. If you like what you saw, you can now see it a lot more by buying WordFacts branded merch like stickers, shirts, or mugs, which help keep this channel going. You can find those and more videos along with daily posts on wordfacts.org. To get even more, visit the Patreon in the link below. At the very least, like, share, and subscribe to this video channel. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.